Hey y'all, welcome back to the White Buffalo Story series. It's a little hot out here today in South Carolina, so I decided to move inside for this one. This is part 5, so there is so much to share this week, so I am going to dive right in. I do not want this to be an hour-long video for you guys. If we were having coffee, I swear I could sit down and talk your ear off about today's topic, but I will not do that. So at the end of part 4, I talked about that this week I would be sharing the renovation kind of mistakes and learning curves that we experienced on the Buffalo Bungalow, and that I would also be sharing how during our time here, God has radically transformed who we are. He has revealed so much to us. He has changed our hearts, and He's drastically changed our vision of what the future looks like for our family in this next season, and we are so excited. I can't wait to share it with y'all. So let's dive right in. I am going to link below to the before and after floor plans on this house and the home tour and all that good stuff. I don't have time to really break all that down again today, so if you missed that, you can catch up there. But I do want to talk about some of the issues that we ran into with this renovation. You may remember from part 4 that we got this house under contract the beginning of April 2015. We closed 10 days later, and renovation started that day. So we had zero time to make well thought out plans or to really run budgets. We just hit the ground running, right? Which caused some issues for us. While we did fly in and make the best plans we could, we ran some ideas and got some very general budgets from a contractor friend. It was not near what we would have liked to have done, and that did cause us some issues with this process. This also was the first of our renovations that Chris served as the general contractor. So it was by far the largest scale project we'd ever tackled, 750 square feet to 1950 square feet, and gutting, whole floor plan change, all that. And it was also the first one that Chris was officially in charge of. So that did present some issues for us. We really wanted him to contract this out to learn from that process for the future, and we're so glad he did. But it was a learning curve. That's definitely the right word for it. So the first issue that we really faced on this house was the basement situation. I know that I've shared that on the blog if you were following back when we renovated this to almost 2 years ago now. But this is a sloped lot, so it was perfect in our minds for a basement. Our plan was to have that basement be appraisable square footage that we would use as a common office playroom space. The stairs to it were going to go down from the living room, and we were so excited about that. We had some contractors look at it. You know, they agreed that would work. So we got the graders out here. They graded. We got the foundation guys out here. And a little bit into the process, we discovered that it wasn't going to be possible to get a tall enough ceiling in the basement to be appraisable square footage. That had to do with a lot of different things, but basically with the lay of the land and the existing house foundation, we couldn't dig down past that foundation without compromising it. With some other things going on in the lot, it wasn't possible for us to get the height we needed, and it also majorly affected where the stairs could come down into the basement. That was going to screw up the entire upstairs floor plan. It became a mess, y'all, and we were devastated and so frustrated because not only were we excited about that space, but we had spent money on that, right? We had already had contractors out here. We were far enough into that process that we were going to have a basement. It just was not the basement that we bargained for. So what we basically got out of that was a glorified storage unit and shop for Chris, which is okay in some ways because we were going to have to bring a shed into the back of the yard to serve those purposes. But even when you count what a shed would have cost, that basement issue still was a loss for us of $5,000. So hindsight's 20/20. We learned a ton from that, but that was a very frustrating and expensive issue and mistake that we really faced on this renovation. Once that space was lost, that left us with a little bit of a predicament because our vision for this house was that we wanted to live here, we thought, more long-term than the others. We were thinking at least 5 years. The others had each been 2 years. And we had Rosie. We were excited to just settle a little longer. There was a big part of us that, as much as we love renovating, wanted to settle a little bit. And, you know, Rosie was only a few months old. You may remember that. So for me, living here longer and this being more of a long-term house for us, I use that phrase loosely because I realize 5 years for most of you may not be long-term, 5-ish years. But for me, living here that long had a long list of needs attached to it. And one of those was a playroom and office space. I couldn't imagine living here for any length of time without that space, which kind of cracks me up a little bit now. Even though we have loved and enjoyed it, it wouldn't have been the end of the world, but at that point it felt like it. So we decided to add on this playroom and office, which I'm sitting in right now, to the back corner of the house, in addition to the other additions we had planned. We have loved this. We built it so that it would function as a 4th bedroom for resale value, so that's great. But it did cost us $10,000, which we had not planned to spend. So basement was a loss of $5,000. Even though we saved some on that project by not paying to finish it, we lost $5,000 there without the added function, and then we added 10 here. So we still were just starting to spend a lot more than we had planned initially on this house. Another really expensive part of this renovation was the exterior siding. I've shared that we did board and batten hardy plank siding, which we love. We love the look of it. We love the durability of it. It's nice, and so for resale, that's something that is desirable. But it ended up being so much more expensive than we thought it would be. While we did run some numbers and get some general quotes on that, by the time we were into the process and we were committed and the exact quotes came back in, they were so much higher than we thought. See, the issue compared to vinyl with hardy is that the materials are more expensive, but then you have to pay someone to install it, which is a much more expensive installation cost than vinyl because it's heavy, it's cement board, and it's much more difficult to work with. And then you have to paint it. It comes as unprimed board, so you're hiring a lot of different contractors in addition to the already more expensive material. So we've run numbers since we did this, and doing vinyl would have saved us $10,000 on the outside. And so that's kind of a tough pill to swallow. We've talked a lot about would we make that same choice again. I think we would. You know, it's hard. Like I said, hindsight is 20/20. But while most of the flipped houses in our neighborhood are vinyl siding, there are some nicer ones with nicer exteriors. And we love the nicer exterior and kind of want to encourage the neighborhood standard for flipped houses that way. So this is a great comp for that, for other people or us in the future. So I do think we'd make the same choice again, but I wish we had been informed about the budget ahead of time. So overall, this project ended up being much more extensive and much more expensive than we thought it would be. And those mistakes and choices that I just detailed contributed in large part to that. But another big part of that was, like I said, that because we were envisioning this to be a longer term house and we wanted to stay here longer, the list of what we needed, right? Not just wanted, needed to do was super long. And I wanted a separate laundry room. I wanted a separate pantry. I wanted a separate, very designated entry space. I wanted his and hers closets in the master. I wanted a large bathroom with a standing shower and a clawfoot tub and all of these things. And none of those things are inherently bad, right? Some of them are functional for a family. But they weren't necessarily worth the cost that they required from us with our current situation, right? There's nothing about any of those individual things that's evil, but could we really afford to do them at the time with the plan that we had? And that's one thing that we started to realize as we finished this renovation, as we kind of sat here and looked at all these beautiful spaces and started enjoying this perfect house. I mean, it felt perfect to us, our little dream house that we'd worked so hard on. We started to realize a couple things. We overspent, and because of that, selling the last house, the downtown cottage, and buying and renovating this one did not pay off as much debt as it should have. It still paid off a chunk that we were grateful for, but it could have paid off a lot more. And as we sat here and stared at this beautiful house and really started to realize that, it was frustrating. We started to realize that, hey, we are still enslaved to debt. We are still surviving month to month, and some months we go backwards. And the stress of that and the mental space that that takes up when you're constantly trying to strategize and figure out how to make it, it sucks the life out of you. And so what we quickly came to realize is that this Buffalo bungalow that we loved so much was our American dream. We had built up our little kingdom here, and at the expense of still being in debt and still being so stressed. And we finally realized that it wasn't worth it. That as awesome as this house was, it did not fulfill us. It didn't take away all of that stress and debt and things that we still had. And this is a worldly thing. It is fleeting. And we were compromising more important things because of it. And so what we realized very quickly after renovating this house, as crazy as it is to say, is that we would have to sell it. Is that this house would be more of a 2-year house for us, like the last two, because the vision of what selling this could do for our family was so much bigger and more life-giving than these walls, right? We had this house appraised and we're watching what was happening in the neighborhood, and quickly realized that because of the size of this house and the finishes that we did, if we found the right buyer, that selling this house could potentially put the nail in our debt coffin. That depending on the choices we made on the next house, that is a very crucial part, right? Because we could overspend again and make the same mistake again. But if we made the right choices on the next move, on the next season, this house, selling this house could pay off that insurmountable amount of debt. That amount of debt that when we started out our life, we thought, we won't pay this off in 30 years. Our family will forever be enslaved to this. And God showed up and said, hey, what if I paid that off for you in 7? Mind-blowing. I mean, the taste of that idea and freedom became so contagious to us that as much as we love this house, when we look around it, we see what's trapping us. We see what's still enslaving us, and we're not going to let a worldly thing stand in the way of that freedom for our family. So 2 falls ago, right, when we finished the renovation, we started processing that we want to be out of debt. We want our family to live free. Right as we started to get that taste of, wow, we could be debt free if we sold this house and made the right decision on the next house, potentially next year. As we started to process that last year, God started to do some really cool things, because while we wouldn't have had a ton of space freed up, right? We've made a lot of choices, like me being home and taking on a job that is flexible and isn't full-time and isn't a consistent income. We would have more freedom each month. As we started to get the taste of that, human nature creeps in, right? And we start thinking like, wow, we could take all these vacations and that we couldn't take before, and we could one day have, you know, this nice of a house and this vacation home or whatever. I mean, dreaming dreams that probably will never happen, but that's how human nature is, right? We're selfish, and we start to think about, how can I build up my own kingdom? Right as we started to process those thoughts, as we were looking ahead to potentially selling this house, God stepped in and rocked our world and showed us, or started the process of showing us, that this life is not about us. It is bigger than ourselves. It's not about our own kingdom, but it's His kingdom. And I could seriously talk for hours, you guys, about the process of that breaking down and rebuilding of our faith and our future vision. And we don't have hours. I'm not going to take that much of your time, but I do want to share some of the key points of that journey that are really important for us. And then I'm going to share more about this process too in the next video as well. But it all really started with a book. And I have the book here because I wanted to show it to you. I'm going to link to it below. 7 by Jen Hatmaker. I was in a women's group at the time, and last spring, so 6 months or so after we started processing all this about having to sell, finances, all that, I read this book with a women's group that I was in. And this book is all about the excess that we have in our lives. And Jen Hatmaker tackled 7 different areas of her life over 7 months and ridded them of the excess to allow room for what was important. And as I read this, my world was just rocked in a lot of ways. I started being convicted of things I'd never been convicted of. God started opening my eyes to things of Him I had never processed before. And I started to become really aware of how much excess was in our life that was choking out what really matters. Be it our stuff that we're surrounded by, our closets full of stuff that is never used. Y'all, I have several closets. I'm embarrassed to admit, but I'm going to be vulnerable for y'all. I have several closets filled with home decor, thrift store finds, extra pillows, everything that literally sits there, and we move from house to house because I may need it one day, because I like changing up home decor. So I need all of this stuff stored that I spent good money on to sit in a closet. I started to just become really aware of how backwards that is, and that how we were living in a way and we were storing up treasures here for our own kingdom, and it's not how God calls us to live. So I shared a lot of what I got from this book with Chris, and that together sparked this journey of being aware of our current situation. That we had always said, oh, we're not living the American dream, right? God calls us to live differently. And we were totally living the American dream. Yes, we were doing radical things like selling our house to pay off debt, but in so many ways, we were living our own little American dream that wasn't God-focused at all. And we started to become aware that, hey, we are drowning in debt. We've been selling houses and moving every 2 years to pay off debt, and yet we are drowning in stuff. Like, how did it all even get here? How did we even afford all this stuff? And so this all started to spark a lot of questions for us and wrestlings for us, that we started to just crave something more simple. And you know, we heard that quote, live simply so others can simply live. And we started processing that there is an entire world out there that is in poverty, that is hungry. The world's orphan population is insane. All of these big issues that we sort of recognized exist but chose to ignore exist. And we're living in our own comfort, storing up more treasures, more and more and more treasures for ourselves, working to get out of debt for ourselves, all of these things. And we started to become really, tense over that disparity. And, for a long time, I've known those issues existed, but I think it's really easy to think, hey, what can I, by myself, really do about the world's hunger problem, right? I can't adopt every child that there is out there. I can't eradicate poverty. And so it's really easy to think, oh, that stuff's really sad, but I can't really do anything about it. Oh, well, I'll keep living my comfortable life. And we started to realize no longer is that okay. No longer is it okay to ignore all those issues and us go spend whatever we want on ourselves. No longer is it okay for my neighbor down the street to be hungry and for me to go spend $300 at Target on stuff that we don't need, right? On $100 worth of seasonal stuff from the dollar section when my closets are already overflowing. Like, how does all of that add up? So we just started wrestling over that and feeling tense and had no clue what that meant we were supposed to do, but we no longer were okay in the comfortable path we had been okay in before. Around this time, I also started to really process that the way I had been blogging was not how God wanted me to blog, and was really causing problems. While we were really becoming aware of the consumerism and materialism buried so deep in our own hearts, I realized that the way I had been blogging was sparking that in others. And I started wrestling with that big time, y'all. Over the last year, I have considered shutting this blog down many times because I didn't see a way to not do that. And every time I've prayed about that, I've felt God saying, that is not the answer. You just need to do it differently. And so I've tried that, and I'm still trying that, and I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like. But you may have noticed some changes, and they're all because of this tension that I've been wrestling with. And you may have noticed that I've stopped doing as many sponsored posts. While you may see a random one on very rare occasion because it's an absolute perfect fit, you're not going to see nearly as many, because I realized as I looked around our beautiful home that many months are so stressed financially and are hardly making it, and yet our home is filled with beautiful new stuff that someone gave me that I could have never afforded myself. And yet I'm promoting that on the blog, and I'm promoting other people buying that when I could never afford it myself. And I started to realize how wrong that was, and the materialism I was potentially breeding in my readers. And that started to just break my heart, that what God was revealing us to do personally, I was causing my readers to potentially do the opposite. And while I recognize we can't be held accountable for how every person responds to everything we do, I do believe that when we're convicted of something, God calls us to action. And so that's something that I've tried to do. But it was a struggle, because sponsored posts were the biggest chunk of my blogging income. And I love blogging, and it is wonderful because we renovate houses. It helps support that. But Chris and I both talked, Chris kept reminding me, and we both talked about the fact that I can't take the time away from our children and the other things I'm responsible for and put them to the blog if it doesn't make an income. It has to make some sort of an income. And yet the way I was making an income, I really felt God saying is wrong and stop doing it. And so that caused tension for me, as you can imagine. And that's why I considered shutting it down, because I didn't see a way out of that. And you may have noticed that I've started posting about my essential oil business. And I've posted about oils before. We've used them for 2.5 years, but we used them for our family every day, dependent on them, and so believing in them for a long time before I started as a business. And from the first thought of doing it as a business to actually launching it and starting to post about it and build it in a more public way, it was about 6 months of absolute wrestling for me, because I kept saying, Lord, I'm not a salesman. And I felt Him say, what have you been doing these last 3 years of blogging? You've sold everything. You've sold things you don't believe in. You've sold things you never would have had in your home if you weren't paid to do it. And yet this is a product I firmly believe God put here on earth for us to use. My family has seen the benefits of it over almost 3 years now. Our testimonies about how it's changed our health and our life and our energy and sleep and all of that are limitless. I have so many of them. Why can that not be something that creates a sustainable income for our family? And so as I really prayed through that, I felt God really affirming that that was the way to go. That was something that I firmly believed in. Clearly, I'd used it for so long, and sharing that with others is something I wanted to do anyway because I believe in it. And so that's been a really cool journey to see that in that one area God really provided a way to kind of come out from under that materialistic culture that I felt like I was in and breeding with just constant new home decor, to something that I really feel is faith affirming and life giving and put here by God for us to use. So that's been a really beautiful journey to see. And I wanted to give that little bit of backstory as I shared this whole journey, because it's a huge part of our story. But I also wanted you guys to understand kind of the why behind me sharing that. And that it's been a beautiful journey for our family, that the blog is now beyond just supporting our renovations, supporting our family because of the essential oil business that I've started. And so it's cool to see how God started providing ways out of the consumer culture we felt entrapped in as we became aware of it. This past fall, after 6 months or so after I read 7, Chris and I read another book that I want to talk about really briefly called Radical Together by David Platt. And it's all about how God calls us to live radical lives that are focused on others above ourselves. And Chris and I read it together and kind of studied it together and started to just be on fire about the vision that God was creating in us. That by living simply, by realizing that every dollar we spend counts, by getting out of debt, all of those pieces could have a bigger purpose. So as all of this started to really cause tension for us over how we were living, how I was blogging, the money we spent, every little piece of our lives, we started to be really aware of, okay, great, God, we've been convicted of basically everything in our life. Now what do we do about it? And so we started praying over that, and we started asking for guidance. And there was a sermon at Christmas that really floored us, that we still talk about on a weekly basis at least, because it was so what we needed to hear at that moment. And it was all about this idea of how do we worship a slave. That Jesus did not come to the world as a king living in luxury. He came as the humblest of servants. He came as a literal slave who had nothing. He hung out with the lowest of low. He cared about the marginalized and oppressed. He spent his life on it. And yet, our American dream version of Christianity in no way reflects the life that Jesus lived. We could not be more opposite. Where he was radically focused on downward mobility, we're focused on upward mobility. And he talked about this study done by some anthropologists at UCLA, where they evaluated how we Americans live in our houses. And they came into a 1,000 square foot home and counted the amount of items that they saw. And they were shocking what they found. And what they determined was that we are literally being suffocated by our stuff. That the amount of energy it takes to manage it all, the amount of debt we're going into to accumulate it, all of that is choking the life out of us. And they deemed that phenomenon stuffication. Okay, that was their term, stuffication. And Chris and I have used that forever since. We're like, yes, that is exactly what we've been feeling. We have been feeling suffocated by all of the excess in our life that God's made us so aware of. And we want something different, right? We want to live differently. We want a simpler life. Not just physical items, that's a huge part of it, but also just commitments. What is taking our resources, both time and money, all of that. We want simplicity so that the things that matter can be more abundant. He asked a question at the end of that sermon that has haunted my dreams and that we talk about all the time. But he looked us in the eye and said, what would it look like if, in relating to Jesus and the life that he lived, your family went on a radical rampage of downward mobility this next year? And Chris and I left and said, what would that look like? That's what we want. You know, in Jen Hatmaker's book, she talks about how you find Jesus at the bottom, right? When we are living our high life, building our kingdoms, we don't truly find him and find the real him. We find him at the bottom. And so we started to process, what does all of that look like for us? What would it look like to go on a radical rampage of downward mobility so that we are living simply so others can simply live? What could God be doing with us that would affect his kingdom and have an eternal impact in a real way? And there's one more quote I want to share with y'all that we heard in another sermon about 2 months ago that has become the second part of our family's why. Yes, we want to live free. But this quote is totally sums up what we're trying to do. And it was that God does not shine his light into our life to make our lives brighter and brighter and brighter for ourselves. He shines more and more light into our lives so that we can be the light in other people's darkness. And y'all, hearing that and continuing, like just saying that over to myself is life-giving and has been so powerful for us to realize that God, our whole lives, has shown so much light and blessing into our life. And he is continuing to. And he's doing giant things in this debt journey we never would have imagined. And it is not for us to live a better and better, more comfortable life. It is because there is a dark world of hurting people who need light. And he is shining light into our life so that we can shine light into theirs. And like I said, we don't know exactly what that looks like. We have some ideas of things that we're excited about in the coming years. But we don't know exactly how he's going to use that. You know, we have some ideas of some big ways that we hope he uses us to really shine light in others' darkness and be light to the oppressed. But it's as small as someone you pass on the street, as your neighbor having a need. It's all of those things. So we're trying to be prayerful and open about what that could look like. And we do know for us what the next step is. And we're so excited about this next season, y'all. It reminds me of this post that I wrote years ago, and it's still one of my favorite posts, even though it's so old, called Run Like a Herd of Buffalo. And I'll link to that one below because I still love it, and go back to it and read it. But it gives so much meaning to the name of this blog and to the new meaning we're finding in this next journey of our life. But a herd of buffalo can only see 10 feet in front of them, and yet they run with absolute abandon. They don't look side to side and get distracted. They look straight ahead on the prize in front of them and run, even though they can't see the full path. And that's what we're trying to do. We have this conviction, we have this big vision, and we know the next step. And we're excited to take that next step and then discover what's after that. As I close out today, I want to read this to you guys. There's a passage in 7. I've literally highlighted and underlined almost this whole book, you guys. I've read it twice now. I read it again about a month ago, and I literally am about to start it again because it's that shaping of what we want our life to be. It's awesome. But this one passage I keep going back to when I feel my human nature creeping in and just choking out this kingdom focused vision we feel like God's given us. I go back and read this because it reminds me of what God has told us to do and of what really matters. So I hope that it means something to you guys. What if all of my silly little individual purchases do matter? What if I joined a different movement, one that was less enticed by luxuries and more interested in justice? What if I believed every dollar spent is vital, a potential soldier in the war on equality? When 35 years of choices overwhelm me, Jesus makes it simple again. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you read this story, you'll see that he takes a broad, global, interracial view of who our neighbor is. In other words, what standard is acceptable for my own life and for my own family? Then that is the benchmark for everyone else, which necessitates a decrease in the definition of necessary for me and an increase in the definition of acceptable for everyone else. The average human gets around 25,000 days on this earth, and most of us in the U.S. will get a few more. That's it. This life is a breath. Heaven's coming fast, and we live in that thin space where faith and obedience have relevance. We have this one life to offer. There is no second chance, no plan B for the good news. We get one shot at living to expand the kingdom and fight for justice. We'll stand before Jesus once, and none of our luxuries will accompany us. We'll have one moment to tell him, this is how I lived. More than 13,000 of those days are over for me. I'm determined to make the rest count. And like I said, y'all, I go back and read that every time that I question this vision, every time that I struggle and become selfish and unfaithful and doubt what God is saying to do, because we want our life and our days to count. You know, God says, if you love me, then you will feed my lambs. And that means literally providing for others' needs, caring for the oppressed, loving the orphans and the widows. And we, like I said, we aren't sure what that looks like for us other than this next step, but we want to find out. The idea of launching into His bigger story is so much bigger than ours. It sets us on fire, and we can't wait to see what this journey holds for us. So next week in part 6, I will be sharing the final video in the Our Story series for now. God's always writing our story, and I'll do follow-up videos as some of these big things we hope happen, or as unexpected things happen in our story. I will share those with y'all in updates. But next week's going to be the final piece for now, where I really break down what all of this looks like. We're selling the Buffalo Bungalow, and we are going on a radical rampage for us of downward mobility this next year so that we can live free, and have room and resources freed up to shine light into others' darkness. And I can't wait to share the whole process with y'all, and I hope you follow along. Check back next week.